hello to all our regulars because you are the our community and our backbone. So welcome all the names and a few faces that I can see that we know well. And I believe we've got quite a few new people joining us this evening. So welcome to you. And I hope you will become part of our All About Writing community as well. So, All About Writing has existed since 2007, and we um, set it up to provide the skills and support to help make every writer the best they could possibly be. So, from our own experience and then our research on top of that, we created support programs and workshops that would provide both of those things, support and skills, that would be of help to both to beginner writers and to those with experience, and even published writers wanting to be reminded of the skills and the basics to make themselves better. Richard, do you want to say any more than that?
No, I think that's enough about All About Writing. But you are
Oh,
Joanne Richards,
yes.
and I am Richard Bain,
And
and
yeah,
together we do the job. I mean, most
yeah,
of you, I see from the names, already know this stuff, but it'll be on the recording for those people who catch up with this later.
yeah.
Okay, so our brief today is we're inviting you to let us know what your queries and questions are, and we would like you to fill the chat um, box, whatever it's called, with as many of those questions as you can think of while we introduce a subject, a question, introduce this webinar with a question and an answer that very frequently comes up at these sorts of occasions. And the question is, what comes first, character or story? Do you, as a writer, is it better to allow the character to lead the story or to have the story inspire the character? Josie, I'd like you to tell us what you...
Well, first of all, I would like to say that I think you are specifically referring there to fiction, but we can say a word or two also about non-fiction memoir, particularly. But in fiction, um, I believe that your initial inspiration could be either story or character. But I would generally advise that if your first inspiration is a scrap of story that you think would be great to write about, to pause it and look at your characters, go back and decide what kind of characters would people a story like this, and then spend time developing those characters and building them, climbing inside them, knowing them as well as you can know them, because not only will that help you develop the rest of your story, because those characters will then give you ideas for the rest of the story, but I believe that your story will be more realistic for having real, realistic characters built into them, not just sort of cardboard cutouts slapped on a story that you've developed. That's my,
It's your take.
yeah.
Oh, okay. And I suppose that what I'm doing, my answer would be um, to focus more on the origin of of the writing project. And I know that very frequently for me, um, what occurs to me first is neither a character nor a story scrap, but an image. And an image can be um, something. I'm thinking now of recent images that have provoked stories for me. One was we live on a lake in a houseboat, and every winter the lake freezes over, and I, walking along the pontoon, looked down at the ice a couple of winters ago and had this horrifying moment of imagining that caught up underneath the ice was a body, sort of half frozen into the ice. And I like that image very much. Um, so, so images can inspire stories and characters, I think.
Yes,
Um,
yes,
and I think I agree with you, Josie, that a story that is structured as story without reference to characters is going to be a kind of dry, a
thin,
mechanical affair.
yes. And
Yeah.
I promised to then say a little about memoir because we often have people who are interested in writing their stories. And all I would like to say about that, because it's a big subject, is um, that um, don't let go of story and character just because your memoir is drawn from life. A memoir is drawn from life, it's a construct taken from your life, but it is not your life itself. Therefore, you still have to give thought to what is the arc, what is the journey my character, who is me, is on, and where do they start, what do they want, and where do they move, what do they face, and what do they move towards in the end. So just yeah, a quick little hint about that you can't just ignore story and character because you're drawing from life.
So this runs straight into a question. The first question is Jones, and she says, I will be writing a family's life story early next year. How do I prevent it from becoming boring? I mean, that's an interesting question, and there are some interesting assumptions buried in it. Um, the one is something that a great many memoirists um, fear, and that is that their stories will be boring. And it's such a universal fear of memoirists that I think it's one that you should discard and assume that it won't be boring to begin with. Assume that people are interested in other people's lives. But of course, those lives have to be written in a way that is both entertaining and compelling. And that's where what Josie has just said kicks in. Um, Writing a family's life story is not writing the entire story, in fact. Um, your first task is to select what the story is and what events make up that story or those stories. Because if you're doing a family, then you're doing multiple characters,
Mm,
and
mm,
each of those characters has a story and an arc. And each of those characters wants something. And each of those characters faces obstacles and challenges
mm,
unique to them, in fact. And so it's quite a complex operation. But if you identify the the specific arcs of each of the chief characters of your story, and you trace those by focusing on the events and the incidents and the choices that they make, then your story won't be boring.
mm.
it genuinely won't be boring.
We all like to read about other people's lives. We like to identify, we like to compare them with our own, we like to compare their choices with our choices. But a story, as Richard says, like that is an exercise of choices. So choose the main characters. You might choose in each generation. For example, if you're going back a couple of generations, to focus on one or two characters within that generation, the matriarch perhaps, and her story, and through um, her story, we will see the other members' stories, and we will but we will be able to identify with a major character at each point. You might choose perhaps a couple of major characters in a generation, but don't try and sort of make a major character of every single character. And the other way to make a story engaging, of course, is to try to draw the incidents and anecdotes that make up their lives, and try to recreate those as little scenes in the third person. Say something that happened to your grandmother. Write it as a scene, recreate it as a scene, as close as possible to either your memory or the way that story was told to you. And, if that is a form of showing. If you give us little scenes with dialogue where people are doing things and saying things, that creates dynamism and it makes the story pop, instead of just being told Granny got engaged one grey afternoon and then they got married a month later. Show, if you've heard that story, show the way Granny got engaged. Show, what happened when they got married. Try and give, even if they're little scenes, try and give some little scenes that will enliven that story, and that will bring it alive. Okay. Um, so,
How do
uh,
I a backstory?
yeah,
This is Jabalile, without losing track of the present moment. So, shall I, you want to start? I want to start.
shall I?
What?
I'll start because, yeah,
Yeah.
all right. So, the main thing to remember with backstory is that generally the backstory of your characters, what happened to them before your story began, uh, that is most of the backstory is there to inform you. It's there to inform you if you know that your character had a traumatic incident in her childhood that made her very fearful of cats. Allow us to see her responding to cats in a weird and frightened way through the book. It will intrigue us, but it will build her as a real character. If she hates spinach and she likes, you know, um, she
Tiramisu.
and tiramisu,
Tiramisu.
yes, she you can use those to round her out and build her as a character on the page. And that is extremely helpful to you in creating a believable and realistic character. A lot, but because you've gone to a lot of trouble building backstory for your character, the temptation is that you want your reader to know it all, and actually your reader needs to know far less backstory than you really believe that they do. And what they do need to know can be dribbled in in a conversation, in a thought, and it can be dribbled in over 50, 60, 100 pages. I mean, you could show your character being frightened of cats every now and again for like 100 pages until somebody says, "What is this thing with cats?" And she says, "Well, I was once attacked by a mad cat that landed on my head and scratched my, you know, my scalp or whatever." You can you need much less than you think. And the worst thing you can do with backstory is to stop in the middle of a scene and explain everything that happened before that is going to um, show or motivate their behavior within this scene. Rather, try to set up for that scene that's coming by giving us little hints of, showing the little hints of that backstory that come through before that scene, so that when the important scene happens, you don't have to suddenly stop in the middle of the scene, go back into the past, and try and explain why she's frightened of cats. Just give us little hints, and then in the scene, don't explain it. It can either be explained before or explained after. Whichever way, it will set up for that scene in, and it will intrigue us. It will cause us to read on to find out what issue she has with her father, or with her, or cats, or whatever it is. Um, Richard, do you want to add?
Yeah, no, I think that that's more or less what I would say. Yeah, I mean, the big thing to remember is you need much less than you think.
Yeah,
Much
that's
less
the
than you think.
big thing.
Yeah.
And
We
you
have a
might be
question.
Oh,
Yeah.
just to add, you might be tempted in your first draft to slap your backstory in because you think they need to know it, they need to know it. But then your job, when you come back in your second draft and you look at your manuscript, I always say like a kind stranger rather than an in love person, then that kind stranger will look at those big lumps of backstory and say, cut, 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 cut. Okay, okay, you go.
Right. Um, Karen Hurt says she's written a children's adventure detective series. Um, and her question has to do, so over the series, the same characters appear, right? They are the characters of the series. And how do you develop those characters over the series? In other words, what care do you take to develop character over the series? Um, the protagonists are about 12 years old. So, I mean, this is interesting and it's intricate because, um, of course, your characters will, your readers will learn more and more about the characters, whatever you do, over the course of your series, Karen, because your characters will be exposed to new challenges and new situations, and they will behave in ways that will enable the reader to learn more about them. But you can go a step further than that. So that's the kind of natural um, showing of character, I guess. Um, but of course, you can give your characters stories that bridge the specific stories of each detective story. So you can have them, for instance, one of them can get a pet in the first book the pet can run away in the second book and can be found in the third book, right? Uh, Sorry to be a bit clunky, but um, in other words, you can use some of the techniques of a serial. If you think of television, um, all of those long series contain self-contained stories in each episode, but there is an overarching story that might just be incidental, but it could also be of burning interest to the character that spans all of the episodes. And so you can, I mean, the experts, the marketing experts, say that that is what will get people to want to read the next book as much as the quality of the story. They will want to know what happened to that pet that got lost at the end of book one. Was it ever found? I better read book two to find out. Or the bad blood that developed between two of the characters, were they able to sort that out? Were they able to find a means of compromise? And so those threads are threads that certainly develop the characters. There is a lot of character development, but it's also a kind of plot element, plotting over the series. Does that
And
make sense?
uh, I mean, of course,
Yeah.
your 12-year-olds, I guess you have to decide whether they remain 12 or
Yeah,
whether they
that's the other
grow.
thing. Mm.
Yeah.
Is
And
it
if
okay that I
they,
put on my mic?
yeah, sure.
Okay, so
That's
the one thing
perfect.
I did start in the first one is that one of the main characters, Jama, his mother, went missing. And that is something that isn't resolved in the first one. It's not resolved in any of them because I haven't figured what happened to her yet. But obviously, I've got to do that. But this is very useful.
Mm,
um yeah, what you've said, Richard, is and thanks, Joanne, is very, very helpful, in fact,
mm,
in pulling them together, because one tends to write each one separately, and now
mm.
I've
Yeah.
got an opportunity, while waiting for the others to be published, to look at exactly what you're saying, so I'm very grateful.
Yes.
Okay.
And if they do grow a little bit, that's a very interesting age. So you can develop them in very nice ways, because they start to develop into sort of sub teenagers and teenagers with those kind of adolescent concerns, and they become aware of themselves and themselves in relation to other people and possible,
Mm,
and where they might have been, buddies who ran around and scraped their knees together, they start looking at each other slightly differently and being different in that way. So that gives you a nice, interesting
mm,
set of challenges for them, I think.
mm. So I think what's helpful now, in I kind of tend to think visually. I think I'm going to step back and like do almost like a timeline.
Yeah,
Yep.
good idea.
I
Essential.
can imagine doing it on a big wall with chart paper,
Exactly. I
and
was
then
about to
just,
say as much. Yeah.
yeah, and then try and see how you mentioned the word threads, I think, or that
Yeah.
might be in the answer to a previous question, but just to see what's been set up in the first one, and I'll probably set up a couple of things as we go. But by the end of the series, they all need to be resolved.
Mm, mm. Yeah, brilliant.
Yeah. So that's very
Of
helpful.
course,
Thank you. Yeah.
of course, you could find yourself. I'll tell you a story about Trish and me. We years ago, I found a book um, online somewhere. I don't know why I bought the first book. Um, it was the first of the series, It was set in Wyoming, and it concerned a sort of game ranger type. And we then read 16 books in a row in the series because we were absolutely, we fell in love with the family and the growing children. And they're now, I think, 25 books. I mean, we didn't go on reading after the 16, but we read. So what I'm saying is your series, don't think of your series as being 3 long. Think 16. Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
There's no need for it to end.
By that time, my children characters will be grandparents, I think,
Yeah.
if they decide to have children, which they might not.
Yeah. Yeah.
But of course, you're in charge of time, so you can do
Yes,
anything you like.
yes, yes, exactly. Okay, so Taiki, hi Taiki. When he says, when writing the first book in what you hope will become a series, how do you balance the overarching storyline of the 5 books while giving a satisfying enough ending in your first book should the following ones not happen? Apologies if this sounds defeatist. I mean, I think a lot of what we've been talking about will be relevant to you. But and I think just to repeat something that Richard mentioned, and that we can say more firmly, that what is going to draw people to read the next book is the characters, actually, the characters and the threads that that we came across. And even if there aren't, loads of unfinished threads in the first book, we will read the second book if we're engaged by the characters, their lives and their concerns, and the things that matter to them. I can't stand when I watch a TV series, for example, and then they want to have a second series, so they don't finish satisfyingly and they end on a cliffhanger, and then I don't want to watch the second one because it annoys me so much. I think there should be a satisfying end to the arc, perhaps with a suggestion of, something that is a little bit unfinished for the future, or just a suggestion that everything isn't quite as wrapped up as we think it is. But I will actually read the next book just if the characters are, and I'm thinking of an example of a series that I absolutely love, and that's the Slough House series of Mick Herron, of the failed
So
spies, MI5, who all put in a place that is nicknamed Slough House because they're the useless ones. And each one of those books ends absolutely satisfyingly. It comes to a huge crashing crescendo and resolves. But there might be the odd thread that we're wondering about, like, River Cartwright, for example, who's the one of kind of the main character. His grandfather, who was a big head of MI5, is starting to dement slightly. So we think, oh, how's River going to cope with his father dementing, and how does MI5, cope with a former head of former first desk dementing. So you'll read the next book because of that thread, or just because I really like the characters and I want to see what's going to happen. And another of the characters, who's a recovering alcoholic, I think at the end of one, keeps buying bottles of wine, and she builds this edifice of wine, and we wonder, is she drinking, isn't she? But actually in the next one it turns out that she's sort of testing herself.
spoiler alert.
Okay, all right. But anyway, it's not a major, it's not a major part of the of the plot, but it's a small thread. But I'm interested in hers, so I will read the next one. And yeah,
But I want to just put the contrary view. Clearly, television producers think that more people are wedded to a huge cliffhanger that ends a series, because that will draw people back in 8 months' time. They will remember it and they will want to know what happened. So, for instance, the second series of The West Wing ended with the car full of the president and all his men being ambushed. And that was the end of the series. So we all wanted to know who died and who didn't die. So, you know, there's an argument to be made the other way. But I think in books, it's slightly different.
mm,
And I, but I think that you can, in other words, I'm saying it doesn't have to be only the tiny little threads
mm,
that lead you to the next book. It can be bigger than that. It can be the B story. Right, the A story must be tied up, wrapped up in the episode, in the book, the A story. But there's a B story and there's likely to be a C story as well. And either the B story or the C story can be less resolved. And that can
yeah,
carry your reader through into the next series,
that's
into
true.
the next episode, the next book. Sorry, I'm
Mm,
getting mixed up
That's
between my
very good.
media.
Thank you, guys. I appreciate it.
Does that make sense?
It does make sense. And I think my fear is always, and not that, I've published anything great yet, but my fear is always what happens to those people? You've ended on this cliffhanger. They never get it resolved. But I guess also in this day and age, I can always release something that is just an extra add-on
Oh,
that
Yes,
you
you
make
can.
available if the project doesn't go anywhere afterwards, just so that there's some resolution.
yeah.
So,
The hordes of frustrated fans who desperately want to
whatever.
know.
Yeah.
That I don't have. So it's good. Thank you.
It's it's a good thing to think about them.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. Richard, you.
All right. So Mzolisi says, please assist. I want to write short stories, but I've been struggling with moving from exposition, introduction to climax. I've written a poetry book. Um, all right. So we're going to leave the poetry book aside because we both feel unqualified to comment on poetry. um, you can ask your questions about poetry. You're not asking a question about poetry, but just a warning
No.
to the rest of you. We will say we don't know. All right. So yes, I mean, exposition and and immersion. All right. Josie earlier on talked about the need to tell your story as a series of scenes. And if you do that, then it's impossible um, to get misled by your inclination to explain things, to give backstory, to if you're writing scenes naturally, naturalistically, then your characters are focused on what's happening in the scene. Um, one of them has declared love for another one. Um, the other one is shocked and surprised to hear that there was any talk of love. All of that is interesting, and that's a scene. But if you want to explain that one of them had a love affair that has turned her off from men, and she's frightened of intimacy, and then that's exposition, right? And exposition is essentially less compelling than the drama of immersive scenes. So your struggle with moving from exposition to climax, I'm not sure. Do you want to come? Do you want to come? Do you want to talk and explain what you mean by your question?
I have a suspicion
Yep.
that what is meant is not so much what we term exposition, which is usually like explanation of backstory. I think that term is being used as introduction of the story. But even so, I would say if you don't think about trying to introduce our characters and the stories to us at the beginning, but throw us into scenes which allow us to get to know your character. Then you don't have that sense of having to introduce them to us in a kind of formal way. So think about, where do your characters start out? What do they want when they start? What are they going to face along the way, and where do they end up? And then I think then you have that sense of just that arc of your characters starting out in a scene somewhere, doing something, you know, dramatic. And then where do they go from there? What happens to them? What hits them that, stops them getting what they want? Where do they end up? Then I think it might end up seeming a little bit easier than if you think, how do I introduce my characters? And then how do I go from introducing them into a story in a way? Whereas if you think of, don't let's introduce them formally, let's just throw the readers into a scene in which we see them in action, then I think it's easier to go from there. And yes, it would be nice if you came online and said if we have,
Nailed it.
yeah, if we have managed.
I want to tell you a little bit of an anecdote from my experience. Years ago, I worked for a television company whose headquarters were in Holland. And in Holland, they produced a couple of daily soaps. And they decided to start a new soap. And they thought, this time, we're going to do it properly. We're going to spend the first few months introducing our characters, and then we will begin the storytelling after everyone is familiar with the characters. And they gave themselves 6 months to introduce the characters. And on day one, they had a big audience. On day two, they had a smaller audience. And after 4 months, they had virtually no audience at all. And they realized the best way to introduce characters is to tell the stories in which they're involved. They made a terrible error that they learned from.
Yeah.
So you see how it applies to what we've been saying.
Yeah.
Use the story to have the characters, to show the characters in action, making decisions, making mistakes, and so on.
Yes. Okay, so Andrea, she says, but not all writing can be scenes, right? Or can it? As a short story writer, every word counts, every sentence counts, but in a longer story, everything is seen. Well, I think,
Some
okay,
writers.
I'll, you started with the last one, right? So I'll start now. Um, I'm trying to be turn and turn about. Andrea, everything dramatic that happens ought to be a scene. Not everything is a scene. Sometimes we want to cover a period of time and show that what you've just shown in a scene continues to happen periodically over the next 2 weeks. Or sometimes we want to carry over, say, what I sometimes tell people is if she spent the afternoon doing her tax return, rather tell us she would spend the afternoon doing her tax return, unless she discovers a huge discrepancy while she's doing her tax return, in which case it becomes dramatic, and in which case it must be a scene. But otherwise, we'll be very relieved that you simply told us she spent the afternoon doing her tax return before her big date. And then you write the scene of her big date. You can tell us things that don't, but you tell as little as possible. You don't want to cover great swathes of telling, but tell us things that we need to know. Because telling is shorter than showing. Showing things in scenes takes longer. So it's much quicker to say she spent the afternoon doing her tax return than it is to show us a scene of her doing it. But that would be dreadfully boring because nothing dramatic happens. So the question always is that you must ask yourself is, where's the drama? Is this dramatic? In which case it needs to be a scene. Richard?
And my comment, number one, let me just, before I answer that, I want to say that, Mzilisi, we saw that you unmuted yourself. So as soon as I've finished responding here, we'll re-invite you to
Speak.
have a word, if you'd like to. Okay, so yes, I wanted to say this, that it's absolutely true that you get every kind of mix of exposition and scenes in different books. So some books are almost entirely made up of scenes. The books, for instance, of Elmore Leonard, he was predominantly a film writer, and his novels were written like film scripts, really. And so they consisted almost entirely of scenes. But there are writers, and there's a very famous book that unfortunately I have not bought or read, that is entirely told. It's entirely told. There isn't a single scene in it, and it was hugely praised. So I think that it's a spectrum that, and I think that the kind of middle road where it's what is the most dramatic way of communicating the story must be your yardstick. Is it exposition, which it can be, or it can be scraps of scenes mixed in with exposition, or it can be long sections of exposition, or it can be entirely scenes. It's anything. Anything goes as long as it works.
Okay. I think the next one is for you.
Okay. Mzolisi, there you are.
Thank you, sir. Oh, thing is, I've been struggling with the, I can write the dialogues, right? But now I've been struggling in terms of how do I introduce the new scenes and how do I develop them to the point where they reach the climax. And at the point of climax, I do understand, okay, how I'm supposed to be deriving them in terms of reaching the conclusion of my stories. But whenever I write, I always end somewhere in between, just right from the introduction or exposition.
Okay.
Yes, but now I think I've been answered, and it's been clear. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
It's difficult, what would be most useful would be to see an example of your writing.
Oh, okay.
and then to comment on, because it's a kind of very detailed question. And it depends very much on what, because of course you might show us something and we must say, but that's a great ending. And you've thought that it was somewhere in between,
Yes,
you know,
yes,
uh,
I will share.
that's a possible. I mean, what I'm
Yes.
tempted to say is if you put if you send us an email, we'll
Oh,
respond
okay. Oh,
with
thank you.
and give you written notes, which might be more useful than something that we,
Mhm.
yeah?
Yes, yes.
Do you have
Thank
our email address? Yes. Okay. So we will make sure
I,
that you've got our email address and
okay.
you can send an example of what you mean and a question,
Hmm.
and we will respond.
Thank you. Thanks
Is that
again.
fair enough?
Yes, that's fair enough.
Okay,
Thanks.
great.
Okay, brilliant.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Okay, now the next question is made for you, Richard, to do with dialogue.
I'm terrified of writing dialogue. Okay. All right. Dialogue, of course, is the easiest thing to write because we write it all the time. We speak it all the time. We speak dialogue. And so it should be easy. But I understand that you can become very self-conscious. Um, I mean, there are a number of answers to the question. Perhaps one is that the better you know your character, the easier it'll be to write dialogue for that character. Because this character is a professor, you think, oh, well, he's gonna speak quite formally. Um, he's not going to use contractions. He's not going to use slang. But this character, my teenage character, is going to use slang, is going to um, maybe be all over the place, or maybe be more daring, or maybe risky, take risks. So understanding your character is an essential start if you're having trouble writing dialogue. Um, how else do you make it easy to write dialogue, Josie? How do you write dialogue?
I visualize myself in the situation. I almost daydream the scene. I hear the characters talking and then write it down. And then when I'm checking it later, I read it aloud because when you read it aloud, you can hear whether it sounds real or doesn't. And I think also just a little trick to remember is that keep it short because long speeches don't sound real on the page. You know, somebody say, you break it up. If you want them to, you know, say a whole long thing, allow that dialogue to be broken up by people interrupting, by your protagonist noticing things, just by breaking up a long speech. As soon as you see like a long speech in dialogue on the page, it just doesn't come across real. Um, I think it's quite hard to make that, make it sound real unless you break it up a little bit. And just to give yourself confidence, listen to people, eavesdrop. We always say in our creative writing course, our flagship creative writing course tries to cover all the skills you need to write a book, fiction or creative nonfiction. And one of the little exercises we give in that is to go and eavesdrop, listen to people and scribble down what they say and the way they say it. And I think that that just gives you confidence. It gets you used to the kind of cadences and rhythms of real speech, and the way people cut things off, the way people interrupt each other. Interrupting each other is people interrupt themselves, so don't be scared of people doing that, interrupting themselves, interrupting each other, and that makes dialogue sound real too. Yes, Joan, we will give you information on the creative writing course. um, I mean, we can talk a little bit about it at the end, but in your thank you and the link to the recording, we will also give you information to the link. Thank you, Andrea, for saying the creative writing course is awesome. um, Brilliant.
And
Thank you.
Felicity, you've got a good question, I think.
Not
Okay,
that the
so
other questions
you're
weren't
a
good.
retired language teacher. No, I mean that this is the only good question that has been asked. I jest. I jest. So you're not certain about what genre to write. You're driven to write, you would like to write. I read eclectically and am swayed by persuasive, insightful writing, no matter which genre I might be reading. I have granddaughters, so would consider children's literature. Writing for children is very difficult, I think. Yeah, so you haven't said which genre you are drawn to most. You say persuasive, insightful writing, no matter which genre. Yeah, because my answer would have been, well, what do you most enjoy reading? What genre are you most familiar with is a good place to begin. I mean, if you are very familiar with children's books, those what they're now called young adults, YAs, courtroom dramas and crime. Well, you know what the great advantage that writing crime stories have is that it is a very specific genre. And so there are, I mean, not so much rules as conventions. And that takes some of the guesswork out of structuring and developing both your stories and your characters. So I would feel a little bit daunted myself at the prospect of writing courtroom dramas because I'm unfamiliar with, that level of, or at least most of my information comes from reading books, courtroom dramas, and watching televisions. And I'm a little bit wary of that. Not that I have firsthand experience of crime either, I'm pleased to say, but for some reason I can more easily reconstruct a murder than I could reconstruct a courtroom exchange. But I really would start with those. With either if you feel competent in the courtroom, you've been a teacher, so actually you've been performing the role of an advocate all your life in a way, or crime. Do it. Write a crime novel.
Yeah, I think that one writes best the kind of books that one enjoys reading. The stories we're drawn to are those that we probably write the best. I see that
Crime on the
Anne,
Campus. Great. Great, Felicity.
yeah. Anne Marie also wanted info about creative writing course, and I see Trish has put the link on the chat, but we'll include it in the thank you replay email as well. Okay, and you'll be sent to that. So there is the, yeah, crime on campus, great stuff. Yeah. And there's the link to the website again. Okay. I
Hang on a
think,
sec. Hang on a sec. Just one little anecdote. I
yeah,
listened to a talk by Ian Rankin some years ago, and he said, with his rebus novels, he said the first 60 to 100 pages of his novels write themselves because there's the crime, there's the police investigation, and it just writes itself because the genre dictates really how he deals with it. So if you have crime on the campus, you've got two worlds where behavior is not predictable so much as
constrained in certain way.
constrained. Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's very
Yeah.
useful.
Yeah. Very nice. Okay, so I promised to finish off with just perhaps a tiny touch more about creative writing, but mainly we want to tell you that our annual Venice retreat, which we've been running since 2015, and which fills up before the end of the year for the following year, and it runs in October every year. We had a last minute cancellation. So if anybody is free to jump on a plane, we have one space in this year's Venice retreat, which the dates of which are the 1st to the 8th of October, and we would love to have you, but speak quickly. So if you are keen or interested, please jump and tell us if you are. But I don't know if anybody here has been to Venice with us. I can't, Andrea's coming this time.
I've
Um,
been.
yes.
I've been. It was wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. Highly recommended.
Oh, brilliant. Thanks, Cara. Lovely to see you, Cara, and we're seeing you again this year. Fantastic. Okay, so there you are. And I didn't prompt her to say that. So, yeah, if you would like to join us, I think people always get a lot out of it, and you get one-on-one attention every day in an incredibly inspiring environment. And then creative writing, as we said, is our workshop course, which runs online. So you do it at your own speed and time, but it's over 10 modules, and we try to cover the major skills that you need to write a book. And each one of those modules gets written feedback from either me or Richard. So at the end, there's always an assignment which entrenches the skills in that, and we're very unstrict and unjudgmental, but we are as our all about writing motto is honest but kind. So we try to give our feedback that will help you in the future, but we are not unkind or judgmental. Richard, anything to add?
Well, apart from my usual, I love to say that Josie is kind.
And I always say,
No, we're
Richard,
both kind.
we both kind. Yeah. Yeah, and if you think Richard is fierce, he's actually really a sugar jub jub.
Sugar jub jub. Okay, I'm a sugar jub jub. Thank you, everyone. That was very nice indeed, and I enjoyed
Yes.
the questions. and more power to your writing.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for joining us. It was great to have you and your questions.